Hey guys, it's Cody with After 5 Outdoors. Today, a video that we've been working on for a long time to get schedules to align, weather permitting. We're getting a little snow today, but we're going to be talking about walleye science. This is Phil Talmage with the Minnesota DNR. I'm going to have him introduce himself, and we're going to get into the science of walleyes.
Hi, my name's Phil Talmage. I'm with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. I've been with the department for almost 25 years now. I've been here in Baudette for the last 13 years as the Area Fisheries Supervisor in Baudette. Out of this office here, we manage resources such as the Rainy River, Lake of the Woods, Red River the North. Basically, 7 of the northwestern counties in northern Minnesota are in our work area. So we have a big work area and some pretty high-profile resources here.
So what we want to talk about today is not totally specific to Lake of the Woods, but kind of about walleyes. So the first thing that we kind of want to talk about, can you tell us a little bit about the walleye spawn? Kind of what triggers it? Is it temperature? Where do walleyes like to spawn? And just kind of about the spawn in general.
Right. Well, we're here at the perfect time of the year to be talking about that, because right now all of our fish are pre-spawn. Throughout, actually, I think throughout the whole state, that's probably fair to say. The fish start their movements, their spring movements. A lot of times is driven by the photo period or the length of the day. That's kind of what triggers it and gets them moving and staging in various water bodies and mouths of rivers, or even moving up into the rivers. Then spawning itself actually doesn't take place until water temperatures get in the low to mid 40s. Is when we typically see walleye spawning take place. And for the most part, walleye spawn over clean substrates, so that's their preferred spawning area. Like anything, there's some exceptions, but so they're going to seek out coarser rocks, gravel, and they prefer clean substrates to spawn on.
Okay. Do they typically look for a current area, or does current really matter?
Well, I mentioned that, looking for clean substrates or rocks, that's, a lot of times where there's current, those rocks are clean. So there's a better chance for survival of their eggs, and their eggs ultimately hatching when there's some flow and keeping things cleaned up. Otherwise, a lot of times it can be on wind-blown shores where the wind action will actually clean up the rocks during the fall and winter. And then when the water levels come up, they got clean substrates to spawn on.
Okay, so would it be safe to say that rocks are a big attractant for walleyes to spawn in?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yep, they're searching out for gravel to. I mean, they'll even spawn in boulder areas, but the basketball, a quarter-sized substrates are kind of their preferred habitat.
Okay, is there kind of a water temperature that really makes a difference? I mean, does it really trigger them, the water temps? I
mean, there is the seasonality of it. So I think if something happened where all of a sudden in February, the water temperature rose super fast and the lake I don't think that would be enough to trigger the spawn. But, once the fish get to that area when they're following those photo periods or the daylight, once they get there, the temperature is what's really kind of kicking it off.
Okay, so there's more so of a combination of things that are triggering that
Absolutely,
spawn.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Phil, can you tell us a little bit about what is the best spawning size walleye? Because you hear people say, this fish, is a better spawner than this one. What's kind of the science behind that?
So, typically our fish in, most of Minnesota are starting to reach mature, up in this neck of the woods anyway, they're starting to reach maturity in that, for females, around that 17, 18 inch length. And, they spawn throughout the rest of their life, the females do. And so the larger females, everyone always figures that those are the ones that produce the most. And they do produce a lot of eggs and very viable eggs. Their eggs, the larger the fish, actually, the larger the eggs. So the more protein and energy in that egg sac for the fish to survive on. If the spring gets elongated because of flows or water temperatures don't warm up enough to get the eggs to hatch, those bigger eggs are actually more viable. Versus the smaller spawning females, those 18 inchers, 19 inchers, they produce a lot of eggs, but their eggs are in general pretty small. So what you end up with on a lot of these spawning runs is you have a wide range of fish that are contributing to the spawning. So you actually have eggs of all sizes with different chances of survival, and that's actually what makes, which is a very important part to sustainable walleye fisheries is having that diversity of year classes contributing to spawning.
You were talking about survival rate. The bigger fish, are their eggs more prone to survive or less prone? Or?
Yeah, so there's more nutrients in those egg yolks, or egg sacs, so the fish actually has a better chance at that egg can actually sit there longer. Or after the fish is freshly hatched and still has the sac, it still has nutrients until it gets big enough to start consuming, algae and invertebrates and stuff like, the algae and zooplankton in the system. So the bigger eggs, and they can sit on the bottom for longer. So if all of a sudden they spawn and water temperatures drop, the eggs don't hatch, maybe they sit there longer than what's typical, those eggs will actually have a better chance at making it through those conditions.
So just a question that popped in my head, from the time a walleye moves up and drops her eggs, we'll say, to the time that those eggs become fish, about how long does that take?
Well, that's going to be a little bit variable too. I mean, and typically it's going to be really driven by the amount of time, by the way the spring's going, by the weather conditions going out there. So I mean, it's going to be at least a few weeks, and it could be longer. Now, obviously, the longer it gets drawn out, or the longer those eggs sit there, the better the chance of them, getting mold or getting sediment deposited on top of them and not being viable, or actually even being consumed by other organisms. Whether it be invertebrates or fish consuming those eggs. So it's actually kind of a variable throughout the state and actually year by year.
Mm-hmm. Is there a percentage or an estimate of how many eggs survive?
Yeah, so that's a tough question in the sense of it's kind of hard for us to actually know, but
right.
We have actually had some studies that we've done on some of the larger lakes in Minnesota where we've looked at what we call the hatch rate, which is from the time that egg was in the female's ovaries in September to when the fish actually hatches. And typically it's less than 1%, but right around that 1%, but all the way down to 0.2, 0.3% is still a very normal number to see.
Right. So have you guys ever been able to come up with a rough number of how many eggs a fish lays?
Well, so that's going to be variable year to year too, based on the size of the fish, the size of the eggs, what she's feeding on and consuming. So, I mean, but they're producing thousands of eggs each. But to have an exact number, I don't actually have that for you.
All right, so we're going to move into the fishing aspect a little bit. When guys are out fishing and you bring a walleye out of deeper water, and saugers especially, but sometimes they have that effect called barotrauma. Can you explain a little bit what that is?
Yeah. So when we're talking about catch and release fishing, there's a few different factors that play into the survival of the fish that's caught and ultimately released. Obviously, if the fish has barotrauma and you're going to consume it, no big issue. Barotrauma is kind of like the bends in people that are scuba diving, for example, where your blood and oxygen, the biochemistry gets messed up. So, but barotrauma does affect fish, and obviously the barotrauma is depth of water dependent. So the deeper the water, the more pressure on that fish. So right here, we're sitting at 1 atmosphere, above the water right now. You go down 32 feet, you're at another atmosphere of water. So there's that much of pressure. So it's doubling the pressure on that fish. So what we see in a lot of fisheries is when the water is cold, and anglers are handling fish well, and the water's not very deep, hooking mortality or barotrauma, and specifically in this case, is negligible. Now, when you start getting above that 32 feet of water, that's where we really start to see some effects of depth on mortality of hooked and released fish. At that point in time, we start watching the mortality rates almost doubling every 5 to 10 feet of depth. So as you get deeper and deeper, the chance of that fish actually surviving goes down drastically, and most likely because of the barotrauma.
I've heard people say, if you reel them in slower or if you reel them in faster, is there any difference in that?
You can't actually reel a fish in slow enough to actually influence the barotrauma, and The other thing that we also hear people talking about is the swim bladder. When people bring a fish up and the swim bladder is protruding out of the mouth of the fish, people figure that fish is dead. Actually, that fish actually has a chance at surviving. We've done hooking mortality studies actually up in this area and also throughout the central part of the state, where we've looked at hooking and releasing fish. And the big thing is the faster that fish can get down to the pressure that it was originally caught out of, the better the chance of survival. And just because that swim bladder is poking out of the mouth, now it may make it difficult especially for a small fish to swim away, but getting that fish, that fish is not for sure a goner. There is a chance that it can make it. Now if you throw it back and it's floating around on the top of the water and a pelican comes and eats it, or a seagull, right, it's not going to make it. Yep. But that aside, they can recover from that. But that barotrauma can have some pretty significant influences on fish, and the water temperature would also play a role on that, as far as how well the fish recovers from barotrauma.
So obviously the warmer the water, the more difficult it would be?
Yeah, typically the other part of it is it's more difficult from just handling the shock of, so now they're dealing with barotrauma, and then they were probably caught out of deeper, colder water, and now we're bringing them up into, and we'll release them in 70-degree surface water.
Right, so different temperature.
There's a lot of influences going on that fish.
So if you catch a fish and the swim bladder is poking on the mouth, don't pop the swim bladder, right?
No, we do not recommend what people call fizzing the fish. We do not recommend that. One of the things, when I did some research over on Rainy Lake looking at hooking mortality from deep waters, what people ask, well, what can we do to reduce this? And one of the best, I guess the best piece of advice we have for people is, if you're fishing in deeper water and catching fish that you're not able to keep, just recognize that a higher percentage of those fish are not making it. So maybe move to some shallower water after right, and or get to a place where you're catching fish that you can actually keep.
Is there kind of not a cutoff, but is there kind of a depth where that really starts making a difference?
Yeah, so in general, what we found is under 32 feet of water, there's really no difference in that barotrauma. I mean, it's not, we're not even able to observe it. But by the time you start getting into that 35 feet of water is where we really start seeing it starting to click up. The mortality rates are growing fairly exponentially as a result of, the influence of depth.
Just real quick, a little extra on that. Let's say that fish is suspended. Does that change things a little bit?
Yeah, it would be the depth that the fish was at, right? Okay. So, if the fish is down 15 feet, that would be like catching a fish on the bottom in 15 feet. Right. You wouldn't have it. I wouldn't be concerned about that. I wouldn't have any concerns about hooking or handling and releasing that fish, unless your water temperatures are too warm. It's not so much an issue up here on these Minnesota-Canada border waters, where we have our water temperatures really never get to that level that plays into hooking mortality. Right. But in the central and southern part of the states, there are times of the year where the water temperatures actually start having an adverse effect on hooking mortality.
Now that we've talked a little bit about barotrauma, catching fish and barotrauma, let's talk about the fish that are best to eat. Is there a size, type, not just for the eating of the fish, but fish sustainability of the fishery?
Yep. Now that would be kind of very specific to what resource you're talking about. If you have a fishery where you have an abundance of large fish, where you might have too many large fish, you might have anglers targeting and keeping, and it might be okay that they're keeping bigger fish. We have tried to have our regulations set up to, if we need protection to spawning size fish, that's where you see regulations that protect those 18 to 25 or 28 inch long fish. That's to protect those spawning fish that we want to keep in the system to protect the resource. One of the things that we hear a lot of people asking about actually is minimum size limits. Like, people get upset when they see people keeping an 11-inch long walleye or 12-inch long walleye, and one of the points I'll make is those smaller fish. So in any given year, there's a group of fish out there that are very abundant. Their abundance decreases over time. So actually the smaller fish are actually more abundant, with all things being equal. They're more abundant. So really, somebody killing a 13-inch walleye or a 12-inch walleye probably has far less influence on the fishery than keeping an 18 or 19 inch walleye. So, I think one of the things I guess I'll say is just the big thing is a lot of our regulations are that we have out there for size of walleyes are out there to protect spawning fish. Those are the ones that and when we have those regulations in place, it's good for people to follow them, obviously, because it's the law, but also recognize that we're trying to maintain a level of spawning biomass out there for future generations. But once again, keeping those smaller fish, as long as it's legal, there's no issues with that.
Now, another thing is, even on especially on Lake of the Woods, every once in a while you'll catch a fish that's real pale, and then you'll catch those, those darker colored. What causes that color difference?
A lot of it has to do with where that fish was coming from. And and you might say, well, I caught two fish that were like night and day in the same spot. Well, walleyes move around a lot. They can move miles and miles and miles in a very short amount of time. And so a lot of times what we see is walleyes caught in deeper water, or that are coming from the deeper waters. And like up here, in the watershed, we have very stained waters from the tannins and all that stuff in the bogs and swamps across the northern part of the state. So, that plays a factor in there. But then those deep water walleyes are usually darker than the shallow water walleyes. Like a walleye from here compared to a walleye out of the Red River of the North, for example, where they're green almost over there. Right. So a lot of it has to do with the water and the conditions that they live in.
All right, so here's kind of a Lake of the Woods specific question. The walleyes that are out here, what is their main diet? What do they eat the most, and does that change throughout the seasons?
Yeah, well, so it changes throughout the seasons and based on the size of the fish even. So when a walleye first hatches, it's consuming invertebrates. When they're little tiny fry or young of the year fish, they start off consuming invertebrates in the shallow water. They move out deeper once they're able to start feeding on other small fish that hatch later from that same year. So they move from invertebrates to fish in their early life stages, and then but on an annual basis, and it's actually very lake or area specific on the lake. We can have a hatch going on, and the fish will immediately turn over and start consuming mayflies during the mayfly hatch. I think it's fair to say that year in, year out, that perch are the main forage for walleyes on Lake of the Woods. But that said, when we have a weak year class of perch, we have some other very high value forage items for them, like with tullibees or trout perch, some other species. Our emerald shiners can be common, so we'll see it change. And the walleyes are very opportunistic, so they're going to take whatever forage is most abundant and available to them. But I'd say it's fair to say that perch are the preferred.
Now, just to throw a curveball in there, if you're up at the northwest angle and you're more in rocks and there's crayfish, does that change at all?
Yeah, so like what I see with a lot of the stuff with the crayfish has to do with when the crayfish are, what stage of life the crayfish are at. There's certain stages of their life where they're a lot more palatable and softer and more consumable by the walleyes, and consequently more vulnerable to them as well. So, and that's one of those that area specific things that I mentioned. When you get up there, it's way different than it is down in the mouth here. In Morris Point area, where you actually see a lot of perch and emerald shiners are actually pretty common down in that area too. So, it's kind of area, and then it also changes year from year too, based on what's most abundant out there.
It's kind of like a buffet. If there's more of one thing on a buffet, that's what you're going to be focusing on.
That's right.
Versus if you don't have something. So
right, and then they can't refuse that tullibee when they come by either. Right. Especially the bigger fish really key in on those tullibees. The tullibees are oilier fish, so they provide pretty high quality protein for fish growth. So
do walleyes feed on other walleyes?
Certainly they can, but cannibalism, it is really is a density dependent and forage influence. So you'd see more of that probably. Not that it doesn't happen, but you'd see more of that, or that becoming an issue in a system that had some things that were not in equilibrium. Like if the forest base had crashed, you'd see maybe more walleyes keying in on other walleyes. But for the most part, they're less cannibalistic than other species can be.
So another kind of a Lake of the Woods specific question: is there stocking on Lake of the Woods?
No, we do not stock walleyes, we don't stock anything in Lake of the Woods. So Lake of the Woods is naturally has a naturally reproducing walleye population. We actually, here on the Rainy River right over here, we have a good run of walleyes that come up the river every spring, and and there are also fish that are spawning out on the lake, but there's no need for us to stock Lake of the Woods. Right now, the natural reproduction is more than enough for what the system needs.
So talking about the walleye population on Lake of the Woods, is it pretty good right now? I know you hear a lot of scuttlebutt about there's a lot of pressure and stuff like that. Is the fishery doing pretty good overall?
Yeah, the fishery is doing well. We have good reproduction. We have good recruitment, or fish, having a strong year class produced and watching it recruit or grow into the harvestable, desirable lengths of fish that people want to keep. We have good numbers out there. We do have, some weak year classes, but that's normal. I mean, and that on any year in, year out, having a weak year class can kind of cause a little bit of I haven't caught many 15 inchers this year. Why is that? Well, looking back, that was a weak year class. But our walleye and sauger numbers are high. We got really good recruitment. We have a good forage base and diverse forage base. Despite the pressure, the fishery is doing well, and we continuously monitor the fishery. This Lake of the Woods is in the large lake monitoring program, so we sample it every year. We have sites that we do every single year, so we have long-term trends that we use to help inform our management decisions on Lake of the Woods, and we supplement that with creel information that we get from having employees out talking to anglers, recording their catch. We put all that information, and all that plays into our management decisions.
So what distinguishes like a year class by size, and how do you distinguish a male from a female?
So a year class is a group of fish that was produced or hatched in a particular year. So the fish that'll hatch this spring, you'll hear us refer to as the 2021 year class of walleyes on Lake of the Woods. So that's a group of fish that grows up or came from one specific year. What you hear us comparing, or a lot of times saying a strong year class or a weak year class, what we're actually doing is we're comparing our observations of that year class and comparing it to other year classes in the past and saying, oh, hey, this is a strong year class, or this is a weak year class, or a moderate year class. And so those fish, year classes, the growth seems to go pretty consistent on Lake of the Woods. Some years it'll be a little slower than others, but for the most part, growth is fairly consistent. So by the time that fish is around 3 years old, it's getting in that 12-inch length range, and by the time they're five years old, they're around 15. Around 8 to 10 years, we see the fish. At 8 to 10 years old, we see the fish growing into that protected slot we have on Lake of the Woods, which is 19.5 inches. So as these year classes are growing through, growth is very consistent when they're small between males and females. We don't start seeing the separation of males and females until the males start hitting maturity and they're getting to that 13, 14 inch length group. Then all of a sudden we see the females continuing to put their energy into growth, and then the males stop. They don't stop. Their growth slows, and they're putting their energy towards reproduction. So, I know you and I were talking earlier about, telling the difference between a male and a female. And obviously in the springtime of the year, if you happen to catch one that's spawning, it's pretty easy if there's eggs coming out, whatnot, or if you're flaying them, whether you're seeing ovaries or testes. But, one of the things one way of telling them apart is actually, if you're catching a bigger fish, more than likely that's going to be a female. Okay. When the fish that we see on Lake of the Woods over 20 inches, a good chunk, it'd be fair to bet or assume that's a female fish. When they're small and younger, you really can't differentiate. And I'm not saying that we don't see big males as well, but for the most part, the bigger fish are females.
How long? So, like a 28-inch walleye, generally, how long would it take that fish to grow to that size?
28-inch walleye, it's variable individual fish to individual fish, and and from water body to water body. But up here, you're looking at that fish being at least 15 years old, probably. The
lifespan of a walleye, how old do they typically? I'm sure that's very dependent on a number of things, but is there like a record age fish on Lake of the Woods or anything like that?
I think our record fish on Lake of the Woods that we've aged here has been a 27-year-old fish. So, I mean, that's pretty old.
Wow.
Every year we get a few fish that we sample that when we age them, you know, they're over 20 years old. And ironically, sometimes we get fish that aren't particular. We've had some 19-inch long males that were, you know, 20 years old.
Wow.
So it really varies by the fit, you know, fish to fish. And I mean, you know, and some fish just will never, like that male, he was never going to grow up to be 30 inches. And some females, they'll stop growing when they're 25 inches as well. So it's not like they just keep growing forever and ever. I mean, that when they get towards that, when they get up in that 12 to 15 inch or years old, they really slow down. A lot of them slow down their growth.
Okay, so we always hear about a storm's coming in, it's going to shut down the bite and all that stuff. What is the science of the environment on fish that makes them feed, or is there anything that really triggers them, or is it just more just how the fish is feeling?
Well, you know, I mean, some of it might be how the fish is feeling or what the forage base is out there. I mean, we have years where we know that there's a lot of walleyes out on Lake of the Woods or on any given fishery, and people are like, well, boy, fishing slow this year. Well, there's a lot that goes into that. I mean, a lot of it can have to do with water clarity. A lot can have to do with the forage base, as we were discussing earlier. You know, when we have a forage base when we have a big year class of yellow perch, for example, there's plenty of food out there for them. They're less likely to be hungry when they come swimming by your hook. You know, and a lot of times, you know, when the pressure's stable and the weather's stable, the fishing is good. Or if you hit it right in the right drop or rise in pressure, you can have a good hour or two long bite type thing. But for the most part, when the pressure's steady and weather's favorable, is the best conditions. Up here on these waters up here where we have more stained waters with all those tannins in it, they're different as far as the timing of the bite, because up here we have dark water. Our fish in general, I mean, like I say, in general, the night bite isn't here the way it is down in the clearer waters in the southern or central part of the state. Our waters are just naturally stained. It's not pollution, and so our bite actually picks up during the daylight hours, and by the time it gets dark, it's pretty much done. Okay,
because walleyes are very light sensitive, right?
Yep. They're negatively phototactic, is what we call it, or they prefer low light conditions.
So what are some of the things that causes a walleye to go inactive?
So I mean, when through different times of the year, fish are in different modes. So when water temperatures get high in the summertime, for example, we see fish actually turn. There's like a peak feeding temperature, you know, where all of a sudden, okay, feeding and growth is going well. It gets too much warm, the fish actually becomes stressed. It changes the fish's metabolism. The fish will slow down. So it can be temperature dependent. It can be based on what season it is too. I mean, whether it's post spawn or pre spawn or during spawn. Those all, or when they're in that transition going back post spawn, I mean, a lot of times that's when you hear people saying, you know, we're really getting into them good. The fish are all spent. They just got done expending a lot of energy, spawning, and now they're looking for food. So a lot of it has to do with that timing of the year and the temperature of the water.
Okay. As far as something else that just came to mind, fish migration. Do these fish, do they travel a lot of the lake, or are they territorial, or?
We have not done a lot of telemetry work on Lake of the Woods, but we do know from a lot of other telemetry studies throughout the country that fish move. Walleyes will move a long distance. I mean, even in a day, some of them can move. We have, you know, fish that we know are coming from Lake of the Woods, for example, and spawning in the Rainy River, where they're moving, you know, 40 miles up to the Birchdale. Or in a year like this, where we actually have low water conditions and less habitat out there, we'll have fish running all the way up to the dam in International Falls as well. So they'll just be spread out. So that's 80 miles of river. So they will cover a lot of ground and a lot of area. And, you know, and even throughout like the open water period or in the summertime, we'll get a lot of fish movement. You know, we'll hear people being like, oh, they're biting well on the south shore. And then the next thing you know, they can't mark them there. Well, all of a sudden they're on a hatch going on up by Garden Island or something like that. So they're not going to waste their energy, and so everything they do, they're doing for a purpose. They're doing it because they're looking for a different food source, or they're doing it because they're looking for spawning habitat. They're very efficient with what they do.
Okay. So follow the food, that's kind of a key phrase?
I think that's fair to say, yeah. I mean, if you want to be where, I mean, that doesn't mean that that's the only place there's going to be fish, but it's a good start.
So we've heard a lot this year. If you followed the fishing report every week, you've heard a lot about water clarity on Lake of the Woods. Can you talk about the water clarity, zebra mussels, and invasive species a little bit?
Yeah, so with the winter fishing, one of the things that we see is what really drives the water clarity is if right before ice forms, if we get really windy conditions, we'll end up with that really murky water. And that'll kind of slow the bite down. We didn't really have that this year. We had pretty good conditions going into the winter and during ice formation. So we had less suspended sediment less suspended sediment in the water column. And so that really played a big factor, and you mentioned zebra mussels, things like that, which we do know, filter a lot of water. We don't have an abundance of them here at this point in time that would be able to adequately filter out Lake of the Woods or have an impact yet. Hopefully we don't ever get to that point in time with zebra mussels on Lake of the Woods, but Lake of the Woods is in the last 15 years, Lake of the Woods has had two different new invasive species show up here. We have the spiny water fleas and then the zebra mussels. And the zebra mussels are the newest one. They've only been here for about 2 years. So far we haven't even captured an adult, but we know they're reproducing because we're getting the veligers or the immature zebra mussels in some of our zooplankton nets. So we know they're out there somewhere, but probably not in a big enough number yet for us to be able to observe the actual the zebra mussels. And then I mentioned those spiny water fleas. So the zebra mussels are filtering the water, and then the spiny water fleas are these little tiny critters that swim around, and they've actually had some pretty significant influence on, almost more specifically, on our forage base, in the sense of they've become more abundant, and they've replaced a lot of our native zooplankton, or the little critters that live in the water column. And so we have zebra mussels and we have spiny water fleas, and we have both of them acting in concert together, causing change. So right now Lake of the Woods has got a lot of change taking place. We have the zebra mussels and the spiny water fleas kind of messing with the base of the food web, and potentially, we haven't seen it actually get to a point where it's having an impact on the sport fishery yet, and not sure that it will. But at this point in time, it's not, the information's not there. We have the rising pressure. More specifically in the wintertime, we've watched pressure increase steadily over the last 20 years in the wintertime. The summer fishery is pretty stable on the amount of pressure we see, but that winter fishery has seen a big increase. So those are some of the big stressors that we see facing Lake of the Woods these days, is increasing angling pressure, zebra mussels, and spiny water fleas.
So as a fisherman on Lake of the Woods, what is something that I or you can do if you're coming up here? What can we do to make the fishery better or make it sustainable?
Well, I think we've actually talked about a few of them, like whether it be if you're catching fish out of really deep water and you're watching a lot of them not swim away, maybe move somewhere where you're catching keeper size fish. Following the rules and regulations is obviously is an important part. And, when it comes to going out there and catching fish, take what you're going to eat. Sometimes we see people going out there and feeling like they have to get their limit in order for the day to be successful. And if you want that many fish to eat, great. But if you don't waste them. Some of the other things, though, that I'd say would be big things for anglers to do would be, when we were talking about the zebra mussels and spiny water fleas, do what you can to help prevent spreading these things around. Take a couple extra minutes of that boat landing to make sure that your trailer and boat are clean and dry, and you don't have any invasive species or plants. Get all that water out of your bilge pumps and live wells. That really goes a long way for making sure that we don't keep spreading we don't spread these things around.
Now, as basically kind of wrapping this thing up, do you have any thoughts, or do you have any statements or whatever that you would like to get out about Lake of the Woods?
Lake of the Woods it's an exciting time here right now. I mean, we have a lot of people enjoying this resource. Social media and media in general has really brought a lot of attention to Lake of the Woods. And right now, I look out there and I see in our numbers and our data, we have a good strong population of walleye, sauger, northern pike, lake sturgeon, all these other species. And right now we're happy with what we see. We see good reproduction, recruitment. recruitment, and I think the future looks good for Lake of the Woods. We have these things that we got to keep an eye on, but outside of that, right now I like where I see the lake at.
Well, that's going to kind of wrap up this interview about Lake of the Woods and walleye science. Really appreciate you taking your time out, standing out here in the snow and the wind,
Absolutely.
doing this interview. And one thing I'd like to do probably in the next few months is maybe do another video on sturgeon science, about sturgeon. It's a very interesting species, and they're very popular. Fishing's going on right now on the Rainy River. So,
well, thank you. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'd be happy to catch up to you. Let's try to do that one when we got a little warmer weather.
Right, absolutely. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you like the channel and what we do, please subscribe. And I hope you can get out and enjoy God's great outdoors, and we'll see you on the next one.